So we're talking about the perspective of the powers. So in this period of time in which we enter the story, the greatest empire the world had ever seen was currently in charge of things. Right? They had built a road system that went all over the known world. They had developed things. And so God inserted Christ into the perfect moment in history for the message of Christ to be blasted throughout the world. Because never before had normal people been able to travel great distances like this. And now ordinary people could either on foot or by animal travel great distances. And because of that, the king of the day, Caesar, was able to call for everyone to go to their home city to be taxed. Before, in order for taxes to be collected, they would have had to send people all over the world from Rome, travel them out, send them out, collect the taxes, be at risk of getting robbed because you're carrying great carts of cash back to Rome, right? And so there were thieves everywhere that were ready to take these carts and all kinds of things. And so then you had to employ troops and troops and troops of people to travel with the tax collectors in order to do all of this. So these roads were built so that ordinary people could travel. And instead of sending out the tax collectors, they said, hey, everybody come to us. Everybody has to go home. And it doubled as a census so that they could count how many people were in the empire. Why do you think they wanted to know how many people were in that particular part of the world? Why does that matter? It's not just for bragging rights, by the way. Partially so that they can make sure they're taxing everybody, right? It also has to do with so that they could make sure they could control everybody. You have to make sure you have the right amount of soldiers in each place so that you can keep control of everybody. If you don't know how many people are there, how do you know how many soldiers to keep there, right? So they trying to make sure that everybody stays under control, there's not any uprisings. They need to know how many people are in each place. And so there's a lot of reasons for the census. So it's a wise thing to do for Caesar to make sure he knows where everybody's at. And so they made a decree. All the world, everybody in the world has to be taxed. Can you imagine one power being in control of the whole world and being in charge of taxes? Our government here and the government in the United States and everywhere that I have lived is terrible at taxes. It's just terrible at it, right? We don't know if people are paying taxes or not. We're just kind of like, I hope everybody's paying taxes, right? And we'll audit the people that do pay taxes. Audit the people that don't pay taxes, right? So they tax the entire world. It's a huge ordeal, okay? And it's all exactly as God ordained it. He inserted Christ exactly at the moment that Christ needed to be inserted. And as we'll find out in a little while, he used the powers that be. And while they believe themselves to be in control, the real power is God himself. And so we're going to look at the perspective of these powers today. I want you to imagine, if you will, the Titanic sailing out on the ice, right? Sailing out on the sea. And they receive a warning. They glance at the warning. And then they just kind of toss it aside because this ship is unsinkable. Nothing can happen. We're just going to ignore it full speed ahead, right? Now, a different picture. Picture a jealous, petty king hearing that a baby has been born, and that baby is going to one day wear a better crown than he wears. And in reaction, has every toddler in a whole city executed. Right? Talk about polar opposite reactions. One is, oh well, it'll be fine. And the other one is a hyper overreaction. But both take place within the powers that be of the day. So the perspectives that we're going to look at today are those perspectives. One attitude says Jesus doesn't even register. And the other one is he's an imminent threat to me. What an interesting perspective. So the first one that we're going to look at today is the power that just doesn't care. Indifference. I don't care, right? That's the first one. And it starts with Caesar's census. So we look in Luke chapter 2, in verse number 1, it says, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one, into his own city." That parenthetical statement, by the way, in verse number 2, it gives us more context. In other words, it's telling us the first time the world was taxed was when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. So this wasn't the first time this kind of thing had been done. It had been done before. And so we're getting an idea here that the people were kind of used to this. It wasn't a great surprise to anybody that Caesar would tax the whole world. All right. So when it happened, everybody just said, all right, here we go. Here we go again. Everybody has to pack up and go to wherever they're from to pay the taxes. And it says, and all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. For greater context here, we have an emperor who taxes the world. The whole world has to move, right? When the emperor tells you to jump, you ask, how high? Okay? Otherwise, you get executed. So everyone obeys. There's no questions about it. You just do it. Here we go. We're getting taxed. It's time for taxes. We got to pay taxes. There's no questions about it. Caesar has a census. The empire rolls on. There's a Messiah that is about to be born, the King of Kings, the most important human being ever to have been born in the history of the universe. The God-man is about to be born, and yet time just rolls on as if nothing's happening. The whole world has to be taxed. And so Mary and Joseph have to get up and move. It doesn't matter that they're expecting a baby. It doesn't matter that that baby is God himself. Here they go. The power that simply doesn't care. Look with me in Ecclesiastes chapter number 8 in the New Testament. Or excuse me, Ecclesiastes, not Ephesians. Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. Ecclesiastes chapter number 8. Verse number 4, it says this, where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say unto him, what doest thou? In other words, what the king says goes, and you do it. Mary and Joseph were carrying the most important baby who would ever be carried. She was going to give birth to the most important person who would ever be born. And yet, the king says, go. And what do they have to do? They have to go. Oftentimes, we as Christians can get a spirit of rebellion. And we think, I'm above that. We shouldn't have to do that. And we can get rebellious. That's not to say that we shouldn't cast our vote and we shouldn't be allowed to voice a complaint or anything like that, and we should. But when the power has said to do something, as a believer, sometimes we just have to buckle down and do it, don't we? And Joseph and Mary were doing the most important thing in the universe. They were about to give birth to the Christ child. They were going to have to raise this special baby. And yet, when Caesar said go, they had to go. The world rolled on. Everything didn't stop just for them. Sometimes we think the world revolves around us. In this case, the world literally does revolve around this child. And the parents still obeyed the government in this case. Interesting. Secondly, we have a world system that always continues business as usual. Business as usual. The empire rolls on. Business as usual. Look with me in the Old Testament book of Daniel. Daniel is a very, very interesting book. It can be a confusing book to people, but it teaches us some things about how our responses should be, especially to a government that does not love God, that wants nothing to do with God. How should we respond to that? Daniel chapter 4, verse number 35, it says, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? So we have a comparison made. Do you remember in the last verse that we looked at, that same question was asked, what doest thou? Right? No one can ask the king that. In this passage, it's not talking about an earthly king, it's talking about a heavenly king. And he works, and he actually works within the systems of the world. And he's controlling the things that are happening. And we can look at our government and say, what doest thou? But in actuality, we really ought to look in the face of God and ask him, and it says we can't. The truth is that God is in control. The world is moving on business as usual, according to what God allows, according to what God orchestrates. And yes, it's business as usual. Caesar decided to tax the world, so everyone gets taxed. But God used Caesar to tax the world. God placed his hand over Caesar. He did what he asked him to do. Caesar thinks he's in control, and the truth is, yes, in a sense he's in control. It's just business as usual, but the truth is, business as usual is under the thumb of God. And he uses this man to do something. He uses pagan rulers to fulfill prophecy. Let's look at that quickly. Look in the Old Testament book of Micah with me. Micah chapter 5. We're all over the place this morning, and that's a good thing. We like to turn pages at Living Waters Baptist Church. Micah chapter 5, verse number 2. This is a prophetical book. And Micah says this, "But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose going forth have been told from of old, from everlasting." It is no accident that Mary happened to be on the verge of having a baby when Caesar called the world to be taxed. That's not something that happens by accident. God pre-planned this. God knows that Caesar's doing this. God uses Caesar to accomplish his will. How is it that a young family that doesn't live in Bethlehem, they live somewhere else? I think that's another reason why Mary might have been very surprised to find out that she was chosen to be the one to carry the child. Because a Jewish young person who'd spent their time in the synagogue would have understood that the prophecy said Bethlehem. So she's probably thinking to herself, me? I'm not from Bethlehem. I don't live in Bethlehem. And yet she got that. Surprise. And everybody that they must have told about it must have been like, Mary, you're wrong. There's no way. You're not from Bethlehem. You don't fit the bill, right? You don't fit. Sure, you're of the lineage of David. You fit there, but you're not from Bethlehem. You're not having this baby in Bethlehem. Newsflash, she is. Right? God can do whatever he wants. And he orchestrated that the whole world hit the road just so that baby could be born in Bethlehem. Pretty amazing. We think we're in control. Caesar thinks he's in control. He's completely indifferent to the plans of God. And God can use a pagan king to fulfill what he wants to be done anyway. We often think that we have to fight things. God fights things. We can fight for God, but God's the one that does the fighting. He's the one that does the planning. He's the one that does the orchestrating, and we simply plug ourselves in to the will of God. Mary, when she's speaking with that angel, pretty clearly does not understand what's going on. She even voices to that effect, like, how can this be? I don't understand. But she was willing to submit herself to the will of God. The difference between Mary and Caesar is he's submitting to the will of God whether he realizes it or not. We all will be a vessel unto honor or a vessel unto dishonor, right? And the difference between the two is one submits itself and the other one is being used whether it wants to or not. We'll all be used of God. We can either be used of God on purpose or we can be used of God on accident. The Caesar thought he was in power. He thought he was in control. He thought he was orchestrating things according to his own heart's desire. But the truth is he was used of God to accomplish what God wanted to do in this world. Just as the Egyptian Pharaoh in the book of Genesis was used of God to preserve God's people during famine. He had no idea that there was a group of people living out in the wilderness that he was going to give the land of Goshen to. No clue. When he promoted Joseph into office. But God used it to preserve those people, didn't he? God uses the people in power. Look with me back in the book of Proverbs again. One of the reasons I believe in the New Testament that we are encouraged to obey and to respect the powers that be, it says because the powers that be are ordained of God. That doesn't mean that they're holy or that they're Christian or that they do things right. It merely means that they are under the thumb of God and they do his will whether they mean to or not. Proverbs chapter 21, verse number 1, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. Do you think Caesar had any idea that God was using him? I don't think so. His heart was in the hand of the Lord. He decided it was time to be taxed. Maybe there was a logical reason for that. Maybe the counselors around him said, hey, look, it's time. Maybe it was on a set schedule. I have no idea. What I do know is this. Whether he planned it or not, God used it. It was in God's mind to do it. And so it became in Caesar's mind to do it. God used him. His heart was in the hand of the Lord, and he moved it like the rivers of water wherever he wanted it to go. That's the Lord's power to do. Secondly, we have the power, first of all, we had the power that doesn't care, the indifference. And secondly, we have the power that fears and fights. This is a hostile power. There are powers, even in our world today, that don't care. We live in a country of a power that doesn't care. All right? Australia is a power that doesn't care what God's doing in the world. It's an indifferent power. There are powers in the world right now that are actively hostile to God, that hate God, that fight against God. They're hostile powers. Jesus was born into one such power. On the grand scheme of things, Caesar could care less. But on the local scheme of things, Herod cared very much. He cared very much, and he was very upset to hear that a king was born. A little bit of context here. The Jewish people were kind of known as rabble-rousers, right? They were known to be a rebellious group of people because they hated the concept of anybody lording over them. They were not agreeable to the concept of being a conquered people. If you'll remember the history, they'd been conquered before. Babylon had come in, taken them away. Assyria had come in, taken them away. They'd finally got back. They'd rebuilt the city under Nehemiah and rebuilt the walls, and under Ezra rebuilt the temple, and they'd rebuilt everything, and they liked it how it was, and then Rome comes in and takes over. They hated it, and everybody knew it. The Romans knew it. Everybody knew it. Rome did not deal well with uprising. And if a local king, which in this case was Herod, was set up, and that local king failed to put down uprising, Rome would send people in and forcibly put down the uprising, and in the process execute the king who failed to put down the uprising. So Herod, when he hears of a king being born, realizes something. One, he's jealous, doesn't want anybody to destroy his power, okay? And two, realizes that if he fails to put this down and rumor gets around that there's a Jewish king born, Rome's going to come in and he's going to be put to death and his family's going to be deposed. All right? So it's a serious threat to him. So look at it from the perspective of Herod for a moment. All right? You're under the Roman government, and while you're a king, you're not the king. And if this other king comes to power, you're in trouble. If these people uprise, you have to put that down, or you're done for. Herod is troubled. He's also deceptive. He is murderous in his wrath. Go with me to Matthew chapter number 2. When the wise men come, by the way, I don't believe this is the same time frame as when Jesus was born. I think this was likely at least a couple of months later, if not a year or two later, because Herod commands that the babies 2 years and under be murdered. If the baby had just been born, that would not be necessary. So I think he's probably around a year-ish old, okay? When the wise men arrived, they've been following the star that showed up in the east. Another reason is the star likely appeared around the time that Christ was born, in which case it would have taken them time to travel from afar, as they say. And so there could have been several months to a year of travel time involved here. And they go to the wrong place. They go to Jerusalem, and then they have to go to Bethlehem. So there's time here in between. Matthew chapter number 2, verse number 3. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when they had gathered together all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded them where Christ should be born. And they said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, which we just read a second ago. And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Look with me down at verse number 8. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child, and when ye have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. Look with me in verse number 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. So we have a few pieces here to the puzzle, but let me just kind of fill in the gaps so we don't take the whole time reading the story here. But we've got Jesus has been born in Bethlehem. The wise men see the star and they travel. I believe when they say we've seen his star in the east, they're not saying that we look east and see the star, but rather we were in the east when we saw the star. All right? So they travel and they show up, and they show up to Jerusalem because that's where the star is. And they go in and they ask, where is this king? They expect the king to be in Jerusalem because that's the city of kings. So they go into Jerusalem and ask, where is this king? And Herod looks at them like, right? That's me. But they say, where is the king that has been born? And he's the king of the Jews. You know what Herod's title was? King of the Jews. So he's very upset. Someone else is claiming his title. That's his title. He was placed over what we now refer to as the Palestinian region because that's what Rome called it. But that was his official title, King of the Jews, over the Palestinian region. Doesn't like that very much. These wise men show up and they ask the question, where is he that is born King of the Jews? And he goes, hang on a second. I'm going to get the scribes. I'm going to get the guys that will listen to me, my bot scribes, and I'm going to bring them in, and I'm going to ask them. And they read the prophecy that I just read to you out of Micah that says he's going to be born in Bethlehem. And he goes, okay, I've got an idea. I'm going to use these guys. I'm going to send them to find this baby, and I'm going to pretend like I'm interested in worshiping this baby. These are foreigners. They have no idea of the geopolitical things going on here. So I'm going to let them know, like, hey, look, I'm a religious person. Herod believed himself to be a religious person. Even his children did. And that's one of the reasons why they got so upset with John the Baptist later on. But they believed themselves to be somewhat religious. And he says, I'm a religious person. I want to go and worship this baby also. So you go and find the baby, and when you find him, come back and let me know where he is so that I can go and worship him. And the wise men leave. Whether or not they believed him, I'm not sure. But they were warned later on of God not to go back. And they go to Bethlehem, they find the baby, and they worship him, and we know that story. But they don't come back. And Herod is mad. He's really mad. And they don't come back. And in verse number 16, it says, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, he was exceeding wroth and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Of course, in the meantime, God sent a vision to Joseph and said, go down to Egypt. And so they'd already left and they were safe. The point I want to make here is that sometimes when God is at work in a place, there are people in power that are actively opposed to the work of God. We looked at one power that just didn't care, the power of Caesar. He didn't care. He's doing his own thing. This power cared. He cared very much. And he was directly opposed to what God was doing in the world. We live in a world in which there are people, there are places, even in this government in which we live. For the most part, it doesn't care. But there are people within this government in which we live that are actively opposed to what we're doing. I'll share with you just a quick story. This isn't anything like persecution, okay? But it's just symbolic of what we as believers sometimes have to deal with. When we were looking for a place to meet for this church, when we were first starting and we had nobody and there was nothing going on, and I was just trying to find a place to set up a place where we could meet as a church. We talked with everyone. I called council. I called all of the local, offices and places that had things for venue rent, and everyone was super happy to talk to me about renting out their venue. And some were willing to sign a contract. And we got to the point with one place just a couple of blocks down this way that was willing to rent us a nice room that had a kitchen and all these different things. And the second they found out it was for a church, they were like, nope, never mind. Now, they couldn't say that because then we could sue them. But all of a sudden, they weren't interested anymore. Right? They were interested until it was for a church. And even the money wasn't enough then. Because if you have a church in there, then you don't want to be associated with church people. Right? You don't have to deal with that. It was all good until it was a church. Even this building, the first time I contacted them, were open to having us use it as a venue, even on a regular basis. If it was a play group, if it was a music thing, if it was something else. But when they found out it was a church, they weren't interested. It took months of developing relationships with the people in this building before they finally let us rent here. And then once they let us rent here, they had to let all the other churches start renting here, right? So there's all kinds of groups in here now. But it took time. It took relationship building. And that's I wouldn't call that persecution, okay? I'm not trying to say that that's persecution, because it's not, right? Real Christians, Christians go through real persecution all the time. All right, that's not persecution. It's just discomfort. But there are people who are actively opposed to what we're doing and will do what they can to stop it. Herod went so far as murdering children. Right? Most people aren't going that far, but there are places in the world where they do go that far. If you were to take a little trip to Nigeria, West Africa right now, there are people being put to death for being Christians. Women, children, everybody. Just for being associated or having even attended church. Some of these people weren't even Christians. They just showed up to church one time and they got put to death. There are places in the world even now where the very mention of the name Jesus Christ will get you killed. It exists. Go with me to Psalm chapter number 2. Jesus' day was unique in the sense that Christ was placed in it, but it's not unique in the sense that the governments of his day were completely different to those that we have now. To this day, there are still powers that fear and fight God. They're hostile to what we're trying to accomplish in this world because we believe in a king that is above them and they don't like it. Psalm 2, verse number 1, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. I just want to pause there at that verse, against his anointed. Who's the Lord's anointed? I think if you want to be specific about it, it's speaking about Christ. I think it also applies to those that work on behalf of Christ, because we were anointed of God to do what Christ is doing in the world. So they rage. Why do the people rage? Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing or an empty thing, right? That means that their minds are focused on something that doesn't matter. Herod's mind was focused on something that mattered to him, but ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't matter because earthly kingdoms pass away. Guess what? The line of Herod does not exist anymore. I don't know that there is anybody alive today that can actually trace their heritage back to Herod. Maybe there is. I don't know that they would want to claim that. But that line, it does not exist. There is no ruling power that exists that traces itself back to Herod. They don't exist anymore. Ultimately, they didn't matter. But he was troubled. He was deceptive. He was murderous. He feared God. And not in the biblical sense. He was afraid. What happens to a deadly animal when you back him into a corner? He bites you. Herod felt backed into a corner and he decided to bite. And hundreds of babies suffered as a result in families. Satan is also working through human thrones. Just as we looked at God is working through human thrones, Satan is working through human thrones. And he worked at this time for an active purpose. Go with me all the way back to the book of Genesis, chapter number 3. That's how old this fight is. Genesis chapter number 3. In verse number 15, God is speaking to the serpent embodied by Satan himself. And he says this, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, the seed, and thou shalt bruise his heel. In other words, God is telling Satan, this battle is not going to end until your head is crushed. There is a war that takes place. And Satan was warring against God in Jesus' day. Why do you think those babies died? Was it just so that Herod could preserve his throne? Or was there something bigger going on? Satan was trying to wipe out the seed of the woman before he even had a chance to redeem the world. Wipe him out. How many times do you think Satan has tried to destroy the Jewish people over history? many, many, many times, and many of which happened before Christ was born. If you can wipe out those to whom the promise was given, the promise can never be fulfilled. Over and over and over again, Satan has attacked this particular group of people. And in history and in the biblical context, it was to destroy this seed, to wipe him out before he ever had a chance to be born. Yes, Satan uses the powers of the air as well. Go with me to the last book of the Bible in Revelation. This is how I know this is true, because not only did God say it was going to be true in Genesis, but in Revelation we get told flat out that that's exactly what happened. Revelation chapter number 12, verses 4 and 5. He's talking about the great red dragon, which later on is told to us as Satan himself. In verse number 4, it says, "And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to the earth." That would be the angels. "And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne." There's a lot covered in those those two short verses, verses 4 and 5. It talks about the fall of Satan himself. It talks about how he took a third of the angels with him, which is explained to us in other places in the New Testament, right? So that's the third of the stars of heaven that it's referring to here in poetic language. And he says that the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child. Who is the woman? In my opinion, after my study of this, I believe the woman here to be the nation of Israel. Some would say that this is the church in a general sense. I don't think that's the case. And the reason why I don't think that's the case is if you look further in verse number 17, he says that the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnants of her seed, which kept the commandments of God. And we in the New Testament have been released from those Old Testament commandments. So it's specifically referring to the Jewish people, in my opinion. You might have a different idea. But the point here that I'm trying to make is that it wasn't just Herod that wanted to destroy Christ. It was the devil himself using the powers that be to destroy Christ and to destroy the work of God in this world. We live in a world in which those powers still exist. There are still powers that would like to destroy. They can't destroy Christ anymore. Satan knows he's lost at this point. So it's not a matter of trying to destroy Christ. He cannot destroy Christ now. He's already ascended and gone into heaven. That's what verse number 5 says, that the child was caught up unto God and to his throne. The child is safe. You can't do anything to Jesus. But you can destroy his work in this world. And that's what Satan wants to do. He wants to destroy his work in this world. And that starts by destroying us and what we're trying to accomplish. And there are powers in this world that would very much like to see that happen. That would like to see us destroyed in everything that we're trying to accomplish. Whether physically killing and destroying us or simply shaming us out of existence. Trying to make things as inconvenient as possible. Did you know, this is just an anecdote, but I've been trying to look into things because we've been trying to look for a more permanent location for the church and things like that. If we were to start a church in the city of Parramatta and not purchase an existing church building, all right? In order to start a church, one, you have to have it zoned as a church. So you have to go through the council and do a whole bunch of stuff in order to make that happen. So it's basically impossible. But even if you got through that, there are some things you have to do. In order to actually have a church, you have to have one parking spot for every 3 seats in your church. All right? So that means that you have to have land in order to construct those parking spots. Even if it's a small plot of land and you can have enough, you can build a parking garage on it, a car park, you're talking millions and millions and millions of dollars. It's about $3 million just for a block here in Parramatta. So if you actually wanted to start a church and build a church with an actual property here in Parramatta, it's going to cost you like $5 to $6 million plus construction to get it done. And that's mainly because of zoning. Because right now we could go down, we could rent out a commercial space on Church Street, and we wouldn't have to do any of that. But you can't, right? It's too hard. Why can you open up another type of venue that requires a lot of parking? Right? You can open up a business that requires a lot of parking, but you can't open up a church that only requires parking 1 day a week. Doesn't make a lot of sense if you ask me. There are things in this world that are actively against the church, that are trying to suppress the church, whether intentionally or just as an afterthought, because they think so little of us, what we do, and they think so little of God. Go with me to the New Testament book of Acts, chapter number 4. I've got to hurry here. I am moving too slow. I thought, I'm teaching in Sunday school. I'll have more time than usual. Acts chapter number 4, verses 25 through 28. Who by the mouth of thy servant David hath said, why did the heathen rage, and the people imagine a vain thing? Quoting what we read earlier. The kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. For of a truth, against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together, for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done. This is a beautiful reminder for us. Within this sermon that's being preached, he says, the heathen were against him. The kings, Pontius Pilate and Herod, were against him. Even the Jewish people were against him. And God used them all to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. We have obstacles, no doubt about it. We have obstacles that we have to fight if we're going to accomplish the will of God in this world as a church and do what God wants us to do. There are obstacles to that. There are battles to be fought. There are injustices that we will receive. But God uses all of it to accomplish what he wants to. There's a power that doesn't care, and there's a power that's hostile, and God uses them both. And that's the third point here, the power that actually rules. This is divine sovereignty. This is God himself, that though all these other people think that they have the power, in actuality, God himself is the one who controls all of it. Let's look firstly, Caesar's decree sends the Holy Family exactly where God wants them. Go with me to Isaiah chapter number 46. We've touched on this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. Isaiah 46. And verse number 10, declaring the end from the beginning and from the ancient times, the things that are not yet done. Saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do my pleasure. Who said he was going to be born in Bethlehem? God did, through the prophet Micah. What happened? He was born in Bethlehem. How was that accomplished? God maneuvered the events on a global scale to make that happen. Caesar's decree did exactly what God wanted it to. Second, Herod's sword is powerless. Herod's sword is powerless. He thinks, I'm going to wipe out all these 2-year-olds. You know what? He did. He still didn't do what he set out to accomplish. The anger of the world around us can do a lot of damage, but it cannot hurt God no matter how hard it tries. Its sword is powerless. Look with me in the Old Testament book of Psalm, chapter number 2. Psalm 2. In Psalm 2, verse number 4. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. And this is in response to what we read earlier where it said, why do the heathen rage? Same chapter. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. He's not concerned with the plans of our enemies, because he will always accomplish his will. Go with me back to the book of Matthew, quickly. Matthew is quoting, by the way, in this passage from Hosea chapter number 11. So if you're interested in that, Hosea chapter number 11 and verse number 1 is what's being quoted here. Matthew chapter number 2, verses 13 through 15. I find it fascinating, by the way, that the New Testament references the Old Testament so often. Matthew chapter 2, verse number 13, and when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared appeareth to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night, and departed into Egypt, and was there until what? The death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. That passage right there that's being quoted, the Old Testament, the prophet it's referring to is the prophet Hosea. So the people are, if you read through the Old Testament, you look at all the prophecies surrounding the Christ that was going to come, you see he's coming out of Egypt. That's interesting. And he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Well, how's he coming out of Egypt if he's being born in Bethlehem? That's confusing. And then you find out that he's the son of David. And the city of kings is going to be in Jerusalem, and his temple is going to be there, and his throne is going to be there. And it's like, how can all of these things be? Well, God's going to orchestrate the whole thing, and this is exactly how he does it. They have to flee. So even Herod's slaughtering of children is used of God. Fascinating. Does God approve of the slaughtering of children? Clearly not. Okay. But he is able to use even the wickedest wickedness that we can come up with for his own purposes. Out of Egypt. By the way, Egypt throughout the Bible is representative of the world and worldliness. So God is even able to use the worldliest of places to harbor his people. Interesting. Lastly, there's a final outcome settled. Eventually, the totality of God's plan will be fulfilled. Look with me in Isaiah chapter 45. Quickly, we're out of time. Isaiah 45, verse 23. I have sworn by myself. In other words, sworn to myself. The word is gone out of my mouth in righteousness, and shall not return, that unto me every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall swear. That will be accomplished. And there is nothing that this world or the powers of this world can do to change it. God's will be accomplished. Look with me in the New Testament book of Philippians. Last place we're going to look. We don't have to be afraid of things changing, because all of it will turn out to God's glory and to God's purposes. Philippians 2, verse number 10. That at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, of things in heaven and things in earth and things under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. You know what? Herod's dead. And almost certainly he is currently burning in hell. And one of these days, hell is going to be emptied, and it's going to be brought before the throne of God and answer for what they did, whether or not they accepted Christ. And of course, we know the answer is that they didn't, that they rejected him. And they're going to find that their names are not written in the book of life. And they're going to bow, and they are going to recognize Jesus as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. They're not going to have a choice in the matter, because it will simply be fact. They will understand it, Herod himself and everyone that's come since. God controls everything. Few things in application. Understand that God controls the powers that be. We don't need to complain about everything. Okay? Understand that God controls the powers that be. Secondly, refuse to be indifferent. Caesar was completely indifferent. Don't let the schedule of the world, the schedule surrounding the celebrations in Christmas and all of these things, to distract us from the fact that Christ is born. Emmanuel is here, God with us. Thirdly, reject hostility. Guard against anger towards the authorities that God's placed in our life. Sometimes we get upset, right? We live in the West. We have it so good. As bad as government can seem sometimes, it's much better than the rest of the world has. Guard against anger against the authorities that God's placed in our life. And fourthly, rest in the sovereignty of God. Yeah, we vote. Yeah, we pay taxes. Yes, we obey the laws. We trust the king who can turn the king's heart. Pray for those that are in authority over you. Let's pray together. Lord God, we thank you for today. We thank you for this opportunity to look at the powers that be. And I pray that you would help us not to become embittered against them, not to hate them. Sometimes we feel like it. Help us, Lord, rather to understand that you are the power that is, and that everything is under your control, and we can trust in that. In Jesus' name, amen.